Welcome to Psych for Psychology, a Nystrom & Associates podcast. Our host, Brett Cushing, is a licensed marriage and family therapist at Nystrom. Each week, he talks about all things mental health and therapy with guests, and you get a chance to dive into specific psychology topics that help promote personal development and wellness. And now, your host, Brett.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Psych for Psychology. We're glad to have you today. We are going to be talking about shame and a very applicable topic, and we try to keep it all very applicable, make therapy approachable. And it's funny because we talk about trying to make the podcast approachable, and when I think about shame, Krista, I think about the negative effects of it.
Sure.
And it's like, I tend to see when we are experiencing shame, kind of the outcome is we shut down and we shut others out. We're not very approachable.
Sure.
We don't find the world very approachable. And so I know you've done some teaching on this. I took a graduate course on this. And I know our listeners are very attentive because shame is a very common occurrence for everybody. It's not that anybody has the corner on this market of shame.
Right. No, I think that's a really good way to kick us off. And I wonder, I'm thinking maybe we should start with let's make a differentiation between guilt and shame.
Yeah.
Because I think those two are commonly mixed up.
I know a lot of times I'll ask my clients, how do you feel? And they'll say, well, I feel guilty.
Yes. Right.
And I'll say, and I don't know what your thoughts are.
Yeah.
I remember in my class, this was really helpful that I took, and I use this a lot. I say, well, that's understandable, leading with validation.
Always.
And understandable makes sense that you're feeling that way. Now, guilt, I would say, it's not a feeling, actually. Guilt is an objective thing. Our feelings are a subjective thing. So I would say to say, I feel guilty would be kind of equivalent to me saying to you, you know what? I feel really pregnant. And
when you were setting that up, I was like, what is he about to say?
Right, yeah. And it kind of has that
it
effect.
Delivered.
Right.
No pun intended.
It really does help kind of put it in perspective because, my clients could say to me, Brett, maybe they would lead with validation, say, well, it makes sense that you feel that way. And you're not pregnant.
Right.
And you can't be pregnant. So it's
right.
Pointing out that me being pregnant is independent of how I subjectively feel.
Sure.
And guilt is very much the same way. Guilt is an objective thing. Either you are guilty or you are not.
Good point.
And then shame follows logically if I actually am guilty of something. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Well, so one of my favorite books is called Facing Shame. And I think the authors are Fossum and Mason. And they actually spent a little time and I love charts where it's like, okay, in this column is guilt and then in this column is shame. So guilt in kind of our first column involves actions or behaviors, whereas shame involves kind of a person's sense of self-worth. So guilt, we would say, is like, I've done something wrong versus there is something wrong with me as a person.
Right. Shame is a very generalized, I am wrong.
Right. Like me in my being. Whereas guilt is like, I've done an action that I should not have done. Right.
And in that sense, I think the action it's objective. You can see it.
Yep.
And it's actually even measurable a lot of times.
Right.
And so it's an objective thing that you can look at and say, yeah, right. This was something you might be guilty of.
Right. Exactly. So another statement where we're dealing with guilt, not shame, is I've made a mistake. And but the shame version of that is I'm the mistake. So again, just that I did something versus I am something. What I did was not good is a guilt statement. And but if you're thinking of it in terms of shame, I'm no good. So I think you're probably getting the point by this time. It's like the person who they are deep down is the shame. And then guilt is just can we measure it? Can we see it? What was the behavior? Right?
Right. Yeah. And what I found helpful for myself, and this I do with clients as well, is when they say I feel guilty, and I explain that guilt is objective, not subjective. I tell them what we can do then is just ask ourselves, well, am I guilty?
Oh, I like that. Yeah.
Have I
Right.
done something wrong?
Right.
And that can clear it up a lot of times. However, there's sometimes when we do believe
Yep.
we are guilty. We believe objectively, I have done something wrong, and
Yep.
we haven't done anything wrong. And so I think sometimes, for instance, like when people I find tend to deny themselves, deny themselves, and defer to other people all the time, when they start to do some self-care
Yes.
and be assertive for themselves, it feels as though they're being selfish.
Yes.
And so there's this belief, I'm guilty for actually standing up for myself. I'm guilty for setting a boundary. I'm guilty for doing self-care, when in reality, they're not guilty
right.
of doing anything wrong.
Right, exactly. That's another great point. Since we were kind of talking about this book by Fossum and Mason, this book, Facing Shame, I did grab a quote from it because it kind of, I thought, was a nice working definition of shame. So I'll just read kind of parts of it here. It says, shame is an inner sense of being completely diminished as a person. It is the self-judging the self. A moment of shame may be humiliation so painful or an indignity so profound that one feels one has been robbed of his or her dignity or exposed as basically inadequate. Wow.
That's powerful.
It is, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
And I think people are listening,
Yeah.
including myself listening,
Yep.
and saying, hey, I can really identify
Right?
with that. Because I think inherent within it is this all or nothing mentality
Sure.
about oneself. I know for myself, as I've had to work on shame in my own life,
Yep.
I have had to realize, I just throw the baby out with the bathwater in relation to myself. Somebody once told me, therapist I had seen said, Brett, if you could give yourself half of the grace you give to other people,
Right.
you'd be so much better off. And
Yes.
I'll be very quick to give grace to just about anybody, and maybe
yeah.
to a fault.
And understanding and yep.
Right.
Yep.
And offer none of that to myself, or at least I used to, because of shame.
Right. Right. Before therapy. And then therapy
Right.
helped you
Yes.
kind of recognize that, right?
Yeah, it helped me
Yep.
see, some of those blind spots, and specifically, like when inherent within Fossum's definition there, the all or nothing mentality we fall into with
Yes.
shame is like, I am all bad.
Yes. Exactly.
And
Exactly.
I like to challenge clients with that. It's like,
Good.
do you notice the double standard? Like somebody else you'll give grace to. They're not necessarily all bad, but yet you have to hold on to this belief that you are.
Right. Right. So yeah, and giving grace to somebody and not giving grace to yourself. I was just kind of thinking like, how, what does that look like really? So if giving grace to another person is like, if somebody's running late for, an appointment with you, Brett.
Okay, are you going to say because I called and said I'm running late
No, I
today?
promise I'm not.
I have a lot of shame.
You guys,
like-
Brett was late today. No, but this is actually a real life example that's happened
Right.
to me, right? So like, Brett calls me. He's like, I'm running 5 minutes late, and I'm just sitting there like, oh my gosh, that is totally fine. Like that's totally fine. But yet the week before when I was running late, I was like
15 minutes late.
I was, first of all, running later, so that wasn't great. But I didn't have the same approach that I did to Brett when he called. I didn't have that same approach to myself. But and I'm able to recognize that and not like dwell on it. But I think there was a time in my life where I did dwell on it and think to myself like, gosh, why can't I get it together? Like that self-talk, right? That can be really toxic, right?
Toxic, and what's so dangerous about it is we're not even aware that we're doing this.
Yes.
We have this conversation going on inside of ourselves, and we are completely unaware. And
Yep.
I've heard numerous times that we have about 70,000, 80,000 different thoughts a day in conversations like that. 77% of those are negative. So we're talking 55,000, give or take, of negative thoughts. Now, of that 55,000, 90% of those are just regurgitated over and over and over and
my
over
gosh.
again. And I would bet dollars to donuts that of that, many of them are shame-based, and we have no idea that we're having this shame-based conversation with ourselves.
Right. Dollars to donuts. I like that phrase. That was my takeaway from what you were saying, Brett. But I'm not going to shame myself
for being distracted
just
by
getting momentarily distracted.
You just want donuts.
I do want
in the morning on Friday, and yeah, I get that.
So then I thought, okay, what can shame be detected from the outside? Because when you were saying earlier, you were kind of talking about subjective experience, which in my mind is like internally. Like so a subjective experience is like it's in me. It's not something others can necessarily see. Correct?
Yeah, I never really thought about it that way.
Okay.
You got me thinking. Keep going.
Oh, good. Okay. So then what the reason I thought about this with shame is like shame seems to be such a personal experience. It has to do with our thoughts and our feelings and our body sensations. So what are some signs of shame that you could detect in another person?
Well, I when you ask that question, I think of those videos of dogs. When the owner comes home and the dog
and there's
is like
garbage
tore
everywhere.
Up and they're wanting to hide their face.
Okay, actually I'm glad you mentioned that because this is more from Mason and Fossum there is kind of some of those things like a slumped posture or you'll notice people won't meet your eyes. So sometimes when I'm working with clients and we start to talk about a topic that's, really difficult to talk about, they'll look down, right? And that doesn't mean they did anything wrong, but it's just like it's a response, like a human response. Another one might be blushing or tears, like someone might cry. And then I guess there's some more general patterns. So those are like more of the in the moment things to notice. And then general patterns of shame like would be maybe overachieving or perfectionism or like compulsions or addictions. But that's not so observable as in like body language. So
no, that makes sense. And so in other words, we, in a very generalized sense, we want to avoid and we want to hide.
Yes, shame is all about hiding.
It's all about hiding. Yep. I remember, I used to be a pastor, and so I was up in front, and I was, leading a prayer or something. Thank God it was a prayer. People had their eyes closed. I came back, I sat down, my wife said, "Your fly is open."
No.
Can you believe it? So I wanted to run. I wanted to get out of there.
I bet you did.
And it was hilarious. It was really funny.
Right. Well, actually, so this is a preview too of what's to come. So like humor is an antidote to shame. Like the ability to laugh at ourselves is actually one of the antidotes to shame.
Some people might go so far as to say laughter is the best medicine.
Some might, yes.
Yeah, and if you're intrigued by that, you got to listen to our #1 downloaded podcast on that title. Is laughter the best medicine? So you're saying that is really helpful for us with shame,
right? Because when you were sharing that example, I was just picturing like, oh my gosh, like that must have been so embarrassing. But then right after you said like it was hilarious, and that just shows again like your ability to kind of, I mean, hindsight, things are funnier in hindsight, right? But like it shows your ability to kind of be like, well, it happened, like it was a moment in time, and it's funny.
Well, yeah, and so I think what we're doing then is we're resisting that urge to run away. We're resisting to avoid, and we're leaning into it a little bit more and embracing it.
Exactly. Let me see if there's any other little tidbits here about shame. Because I know, too, we have some stuff on vulnerability, which is another antidote to shame. I don't know if we want to skip ahead to that.
Well, we have another podcast on vulnerability and the benefits of it. And so shame does have that sense of vulnerability, too. And it's very visceral. It's so profound. It's not just sort of a like 5 out of 10 feeling. Shame can be like 10 out of 10. I remember one of my professors, she said shame is this belief that there's something wrong with me that's not wrong with anybody else. And I think Brene Brown talks about that too, is this fear that you're not enough and that because you're not enough, you will be rejected for your weaknesses.
Wow.
And how this idea overtakes the prefrontal cortex of our brain, and it actually initiates that fight or flight response within us.
Wow.
And there's another book, small little paperback book. I love the title, and I can summarize it very quickly. It's like the 1970s. It's entitled, "Why Am I Afraid to Tell You Who I Really Am?"
Whoa. I want to get that book.
It's so good. I'll give it to you. It's so small. But
why am I afraid to tell you who I am?
Okay. The answer is rooted in shame. The reason I'm afraid to tell you who I really am or let you see who I really am is because that's all I've got.
Wow. and I can't really do much about it.
Right. So if you reject me
Right.
for who I ultimately really am, well, that's all I've got. I've got nothing left. So we spend all this time playing games and making sure we're presenting our best image of ourselves, because I know that if I let people see the real me,
Yes.
that's all I've got. And if they reject that, that's all I've got. And so there's shame, this belief that there's something so inherently wrong with me that's
Right.
not wrong with other people.
Yep. Actually, you know what? That makes me think about little self-disclosure here. When I got into therapy, my therapist had me make a list of memories, and we were doing EMDR, but this is helpful either way. And one of my first memories was I was in 3rd grade, and it was the eye vision test. Do you remember
Yes,
those? Where you had to
yes.
cover each eye and you had to read the letters, and we all went to the gymnasium. And so we were coming back from that test, and my score, so 3rd grade, I think my vision was 80-20 or something. And all the other kids were like, my vision's 20-20. And they were all comparing and whatever. And I remember the strongest shame response of
Right.
there is something, because what triggered this memory for me just now is there's something wrong with me that's not wrong with anybody else.
Yes.
And so again, when you're in 3rd grade, that is a big deal. As adults, we might not have that shame response, but this is where our shame kind of can come from and originate, right?
I'm so glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
Yeah, because Brene Brown talks about that too.
Yeah.
Where does this come from?
Right.
That the roots of shame are
Yep.
often built at home, or she even says at school, right? As a result of our interactions with
Right.
peers, with authority figures, teachers, siblings at
Right,
home.
right.
So if a teacher calls a student stupid in front of the class for
Yep.
forgetting something,
Yep.
that can stay with a child. So, for instance, I just remembered something too.
Yeah.
In my music class growing up,
Okay, here we go.
there was this song, Wee Willie Winky. And
I'm going to try to not.
yeah, right.
I'm going to try to be.
So it was an echo, and she
Okay.
was calling on people to do the echo in the back of the classroom.
Oh,
So
wow.
the class would sing Wee Willie Winky, and then the echo would sing Wee Willie
Willie
Winky.
Winky.
It's
Okay.
just a little prolonged exposure therapy.
There you go.
for me
This is
doing
good. This is
because
good.
I was in the back doing the echo with all sincerity and really thinking I've got, a good singing voice. Who doesn't?
Well, yeah.
And so I'm in the back giving it my all. The teacher,
Oh, no.
I was so bad that the teacher actually thought I was trying to be funny. So she was laughing, and the entire
no.
class was laughing. And
What?
it's really funny. I didn't find it funny at the time.
No, but you've probably worked on it.
But it was I tried to join in the fun and the laughter, but inside, as a kid, I was mortified. It was everything to hold back tears.
There you go.
And I was glad I had this front, this mask, so
See?
people couldn't see
There you go.
how devastated I was
Yep.
by that shame. So
Yep.
I only sing out loud in the car by myself, even to this day, and for the first time here on the podcast, a little bit with Wee Willie Winky. And nonetheless, it shows exactly what you're saying, which Brene
Yep.
Brown says, that
Yep.
as a child, these things are kind of instilled within us, or conclusions we draw from peers, from teachers, from siblings, from parents.
Yep.
And oftentimes, my teacher was not doing anything intentional to make me feel badly.
That's
about
the
myself.
thing.
Yeah.
That's the thing. And so often it's not intentional. I remember when I got back to the classroom after the vision test, and I was kind of realizing oh my gosh, I'm going to have to get glasses, and none of my friends or peers are going to. And I remember I was crying. And again, the teacher, not really probably knowing the best way to respond, got really upset with me because I wouldn't stop crying. And I was hiding in the coat room or whatever. And so it was this whole thing about, it's not just that I'm getting glasses, but now my teacher's upset with me and I'm crying too much. And it was such a shameful experience. But again, when we're so young, we take everything personally. We take everything so hard, and we're so naive and innocent, right?
You had talked about that on a previous
Yes,
podcast about
yes.
how we are as children and the way our minds work. Do you remember talking about that? Can you
I
share that again? Because
absolutely
I
do.
think that really relates.
Well, I'm glad you prompted that, because as a child, so developmentally, for survival purposes, we are so focused on ourselves as little ones. We're not conscious of other people because we're all about survival. We're hardwired that way. So anything that happens in our environment most of it has nothing to do with us and is not personal, but we take it on as personal. And so this was one of those things where I was a little kid, ashamed about getting glasses, upset and crying. My teacher's trying to just like move along with the day and teach math, you know, and maybe didn't handle it the best, but I don't know. But again, I took all that on as like, I'm bad. I'm wrong. I'm right. Like the shame stuff we're talking about. But now having had a chance to go through it again and process it later in life, I can go back and see like, wow, that was a tough moment in my life. And did it, you know, people are always kind of like, well, that's not trauma. And, you know, like, is that really? And it's like, well, it doesn't matter.
That always helps, doesn't it?
Yeah, right.
Somebody
like,
says, well, that's really not trauma.
Right. Well, and thankfully no one said that to me. But I know there's some skeptics out there who are like, why would that be a formative or like a traumatic thing for you? And it's like, because of what we're describing, where life or death for kids, it's like life or death. Everything's life or death. So if I'm excluded from my peer group, if the adults are upset with me, I'm threatened, I'm not going to survive, because we're social creatures. Like we need to belong.
Of trauma and shame are not based objectively on things that people can, because people can look and they're thinking objectively, this isn't a big deal.
Like, what's the big deal? Right.
And yet it's a big deal because subjectively, not how we're feeling per se, it's the meaning we attach to a traumatic event or to an event that determines if it's traumatic for me. It's my interpretation of this, and the same with shame, that, you know, I can look back and it's pretty funny, that story, you know, in my music class. At the time, the meaning I had was, there you go. I am wrong. I am a mistake.
Yes.
I'm
embarrassing.
Going to be rejected.
Right.
You know, I'm different than everybody else. And as a kiddo, those beliefs are they happen, and then they can kind of be reinforced. That's the lens by which we look at the world.
Yes, exactly. So then I was thinking, like, okay, what if, like, how would we counteract that situation, either for a kid or for an adult? Because, I mean, a logical next question is like, okay, a kid has to get glasses, a kid's upset, a kid makes a mistake in music class. So what are the healthy adults supposed to do about that to, like, help that kid, right? And again, this is how we can reparent ourselves once we know what that kid needed. But I think a big part of it is just talking and asking questions. So again, I think one of the reasons that whole experience was difficult for me is I never had a chance to talk it through with anybody and be like, here's what happened at school today. You know, we all went to the gym, and tell the story. And that's why so often my clients are like, well, why is it helpful to tell these stories that have happened to me? And it's like, because you never had a chance to before. Does that make sense?
It does make sense.
Right?
And I think when these shame-induced kind of experiences happen to us, we don't have a greater context. It's sort of like when you zoom in on something, you don't see a broader context. If you hold your hand up if I hold my hand up in front of my face, I can't see you.
Right.
All I see is my hand. But when I zoom out, I have much greater context to understand things. And as kids, like you're saying, all we see is like what's right in front of us. We don't have greater context, greater understanding.
Yes.
And so later in life, we might have that opportunity to pull back, see a greater context.
Right.
And you know what? Sometimes shame still stays with us. It's not quite that easy.
Right. It's just ongoing, right? And it's finding the times when it pops up and saying like, okay, I'm experiencing shame right now.
Right.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I love Brené Brown's work so much, the way she talks about this, because she'll talk about vulnerability and almost like just admitting to other people and to yourself, like, yeah, I'm having a tough time, right?
Yeah. So one of the keys to overcoming shame, maybe we can transition into that so we can give some tangible things. Brené Brown talks about in her, I know it's book, and on YouTube there's a video, The Power of Vulnerability. And it's the idea of moving into and leaning into our weaknesses, the things that we feel ashamed about. And it's sort of, rather than hiding, we feel that hiding is where we find safety. And in reality, when we continually hide, it creates anxiety because there's all this pressure to stay hidden.
Yes.
And instead, she would talk about being open, leaning into the vulnerability and expose it. Like, hey, this is what I struggle with.
Yep.
And it's disarming. And not only with you, it helps other people
Oh my gosh,
to be
yes.
disarmed around you.
Right. You can almost feel a difference if you share something or make yourself somewhat vulnerable. And it can just be something like telling someone something about yourself or, and it's like people relax a little bit. Because it's like, oh, they're kind of letting their mask down. Now I can kind of let mine down a little bit, and I don't have to be so on guard
Right.
about, am I going to be found out?
And we do talk about this in our previous podcast
Nice.
on the power of vulnerability.
Nice.
Vulnerability actually affords connection, and that's kind of what we're talking about. But when we let shame dominate and we notice that we're hiding, what does that do? That inhibits connection with other people. So we do, and I talked about this on a podcast once before, like we do behavior chains and notice how my thoughts affect my feelings affect my behaviors.
Nice.
And there's this very common kind of human experience that I see repeatedly. I see with myself that I have thoughts of that I should
Yep.
be this or I shouldn't have done that.
Yep.
Shoulds lead to shame. And shame leads to shutting down and shutting others out. And so
Love
it's
that.
a very common pattern within human existence that should leads to shame.
Should leads to shame.
Shame leads to shut down and shutting others out. Now, I work
Wow.
with a population that tends to have high suicidal ideation and
Sure.
urges for suicide. And they especially notice should, shame, shut down because the ultimate expression of shutting down and shutting others out is suicide.
Wow.
And a lot.
I hadn't thought of it in quite that way before. Go ahead.
And it really shows the power of shame.
Yes.
That we can have that ultimate expression of shutting down, shutting others out,
Yep.
simply because of shame. I've often said shame, and I believe this. Shame is the most damaging force on the planet.
Well, I actually, right as you were saying that, I was realizing I should probably mention about addiction as well. Because I
yes.
think a lot of times it's like, well, why do some people get addicted to things so badly that they're willing to basically like destroy their entire life for the sake of their addiction, right? And it's like what I've learned how I've learned to think about it is there's a lot of shame there, right? And because what the addiction does is it covers the shame. And it like numbs it and it takes it, it's this
We
illusion.
self-medicate. Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
It's an illusion of taking the pain and the shame away. So it's like, I can't really come out of this because when I do, there's all this shame waiting for me. Right?
Right. Especially when we talk about addictions. We just talked recently about pornography and how people can get addicted to pornography.
Right.
We certainly can't talk about that. Talk about shame. And it's really important. I think it really underscores what we talk a lot about on this podcast of leading with validation with other people. We need to lead with validation, not condemnation. We don't lead with shoulds. We don't lead with change. And that is not only true with how we lead with other people, but especially true on how I lead in my own conversations with myself. I have to learn how to lead with validation and be able to at least say to myself, it makes sense.
Yes.
It makes sense. So really two things. One, kind of lean into and expose and be vulnerable. So vulnerability. And validation towards oneself. Hey, we're keeping it in the V's. Like validation.
I was going to say, well, you have so many, I've noticed too over the recordings that we've done together, Brett, is you have so many helpful things. Like even the should, wait, what is it?
Should, shame, and shutdown.
Yeah, should, shame, shutdown, vulnerability, and validation. I mean, it's like, I appreciate it. It's easy. It makes it easier to remember.
That's why I do
Even
it.
For me.
It's easy for me to remember that
Exactly.
as I overcome shame, I need to overcome it by being vulnerable and realize as I'm vulnerable, I'm okay.
There you go.
And as I validate and I validate other people, I also need to be validating myself. It makes sense. And but also I think I can't think of a V word for this, but I do think of just noticing the idea that when I'm feeling shame, it's this all or nothing mentality
Yes.
that I'm engaged in. And those should statements that we have about ourselves are really all or nothing. I shouldn't have done this. I shouldn't have made a mistake. I shouldn't have done this other thing.
Yep.
And so I am no good at all. There's nothing redemptive, nothing inherently good about me whatsoever.
Right. Right.
So we got 3.
Okay. 3 ways to deal with shame.
Vulnerability. Validation, especially with ourselves. I can't think of a V word for just being mindful of our all or nothing kind of thinking.
Yep.
I think what can also help is sort of asking ourselves, kind of getting back to this idea of guilt. Because if I believe I'm guilty of something, I will have shame. And so I need to ask myself, am I guilty of anything? And so if I've done something that really isn't wrong and I'm feeling shame, that can be liberating right away.
Right.
That, okay. And so maybe the word is verify. Let's
Brett, you've done it again.
I know. Yeah. So we verify that, I didn't do anything wrong. And I think that can be really helpful. Now, sometimes maybe we have done something wrong. And is shame ever, here's a tough one, is shame ever appropriate?
Oh my gosh, that was such a perfect transition because there is such a thing as healthy shame. Did you know that?
No, but I kind of wanted to go dun, dun, dun when you said that.
Dun, dun, dun.
I agree with you. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up.
So now I'm just going to kind of cite, so John Bradshaw, you've maybe heard of John Bradshaw. He's written some books like Shame or Shame in the Family, or he's done a lot of work on various things about shame. So he actually talks about how just like there are 2 kinds of cholesterol, healthy, HDL, and toxic LDL cholesterol, so also are there 2 forms of shame. There's innate shame, and then there's toxic / life-destroying shame.
Right.
So basically then, which, I love my differentiations here. So healthy shame is kind of like just our sense of being human, right? Like we're all subject to making mistakes.
Yes.
We can experience things and then we find out our limits, right?
Right.
Like where, if I overextend myself and I kind of mess something up, it's like, well, there's no reason to go into toxic shame about that, but it's more like, I'm learning that like I can't do everything all the time, right? It's like I've just learned my boundary. Healthy shame gives us more of a sense of dignity where it's like I'm going to protect myself and we can kind of critically examine our conscience. So contrasting that with toxic shame, which is back to what you were saying about all or nothing thinking. With toxic shame, we're either too rigid or we're not rigid enough. So we either have too many walls and boundaries or we don't have enough and we're all over the place, out of control.
Right. I think that's helpful.
Yeah, right. And same with with toxic shame, we're either out of control of our behavior or we're overly controlling. And then with toxic shame, we might experience rage or be passive aggressive. So again, it's like we're not doing the mindful middle, like we're not doing the middle way, the wise mind way, right?
Yes.
And so with toxic shame too, there's a tendency to be more like scrupulous, I guess, like puritanical or like what's the right word? You're just like overly conscious about every little thing, right?
Right.
Yeah. Hypervigilant, exactly. Okay. Right, with like, oh my gosh, I did this thing, now I have to, almost more obsessive, right?
Yes.
So those are kind of, what are your thoughts on the 2 different, the differentiating?
I think it's helpful for people because there is a place for shame in our lives. And I'm glad you brought it up because this is one of my big bugaboos in our field. Is
okay, good, yeah.
There's so much emphasis, understandably, about toxic shame.
Yep.
And what do we tell clients? Shame is an emotion. And what do we say? Emotions aren't good or bad. And yet, what do we say about shame? Shame is bad.
You don't want shame. You want to get rid of it.
It's always bad. And so I think we fail to realize that if I have done something wrong and I am truly guilty of something, shame is appropriate.
Right.
And because it's an emotion,
right,
and the emotion of function is to give me a message and motivation that, I need to change. So if I've wronged you, I feel ashamed that I've wronged you, and I have the motivation to go and say, hey, Krista, I'm sorry. I really dropped the ball on this. Yes. Shame is what enables me to do that. So if we get rid of shame altogether, then...
actually, I was like, what happens if we get rid of shame altogether? And that's where I think you have more of like the psychopathic personality, right? Where it's just like, you can't have relationships if you have no shame at all because you don't care, right? So healthy shame is like, it makes you aware of others' needs. It makes you aware of like, did I wrong someone versus I'm just doing whatever I want all the time and I don't care.
Right. Yeah. So there is a place for shame. And if you're feeling shame, you can ask yourself, okay, what is this really about? Am I guilty of something? Then the shame is, I can, there is when a should is appropriate. I should go make amends.
Right. Exactly.
And when I've done something that's not wrong and I feel shame, then should is toxic and highly inappropriate.
Yep.
A lot to say about shame.
A lot to say about shame.
And we could say a lot more.
I know you guys just behind the scenes, like the making of Psyched for Psychology. When Brett and I are kind of setting up our topics, we're always like, man, there's so much we can say. It's actually harder to like pare it down a little bit, right?
It is. I feel a little bit ashamed that we're not able to do that.
Brett, don't should on yourself.
Okay. It's a very shouldy thing to do.
Oh, man. Well, one last plug for humor. Laughing at yourself is a really good way you can start counteracting the effects of toxic shame today. Because when we take ourselves too seriously, we're kind of listening to that voice that's like, you shouldn't, you should, So laugh at yourself if you trip and fall and do something embarrassing today.
Right. And go back, listen to some of our other podcasts about the benefits of vulnerability and is laughter really the best medicine?
Yep. There's so many good ones.
Hopefully you've got some tangible things you can do to deal with shame and help you understand a little bit about how shame is maybe having a negative effect and how shame can have a positive effect on your life.
Yep. Well, once again, I'm Krista Overson, licensed marriage and family therapist at Nystrom & Associates, and I'm joined by Brett Cushing, licensed marriage and family therapist, and we're happy we could meet with you today, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thank you as always for listening, and please be sure to leave us a review. While this podcast can't be a replacement for therapy, we hope you enjoyed our discussion today and join us again next time. Nystrom & Associates is always available to those who are struggling. If you find yourself in need of support and help, please check us out at nystromcounseling.com.